Welcome to the latest instalment of the One for the World 2020 Speaker Series. My name is Jack Lewis. I'm the Executive Director at One for the World, and I'm delighted to be joined here by Elie Hassenfeld, who is the co-founder and CEO of GiveWell. Elie, just say hi to everybody as they file in.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Jack, and hey, everybody. It's great to be chatting with you virtually.
So really excited to hear lots of questions that have come in advance, lots of questions we have about GiveWell. I think I would start off by saying one of the things I admire most about GiveWell is the sort of transparency of the way that you're constantly thinking about the organization and trying to improve and expressing doubt publicly. So there's lots for us to get stuck into during the next sort of 40 minutes or so. I wanted to start with a couple of housekeeping bits. So if this is the first time you've joined us for a webinar, welcome. One for the World is delighted to host you, and I'll be telling you a little bit about One for the World in just a second. We are recording today's webinar, so we are hoping to use the audio and the video in the future, and we'll be uploading the video onto our YouTube channel immediately after the webinar. We've disabled the chat function, but we really do want you to ask questions of Elie and also of myself if you're interested in One for the World. And there's a Q&A function in Zoom for you to do that. So at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A function, and it's being monitored by my colleagues, Kenan and Lauren, and they will be pushing questions through to us. So do please take advantage of that. This is very much an opportunity for you to ask Elie any questions that you have. And finally, I am in lockdown in rural South England. And so if I disappear unexpectedly, it's not because I wasn't enjoying the webinar, it's because my internet isn't great. And Evan, who's the COO of One for the World, will jump straight into the breach seamlessly and continue the Q&A with Elie. So very quickly to tell you about One for the World, we're a movement of people who give 1% of our income to what we believe are the world's most cost-effective charities. And the reason that we believe that is because GiveWell believe that, and we're going to talk at length about that process and how they help us identify these highly effective charities today. But we know that if the entire developed world gave 1% of its income to combat extreme poverty through highly effective charities, we could make a substantial difference and potentially end poverty altogether. And we think 1% of your income is a very affordable way to do that, where you can have an outsized impact on the front line at very little cost to yourself. So if this is the first time you're hearing about One for the World, or if you know a bit about us but haven't yet taken the pledge, obviously the reason that we're running this is partly so that you can find out more about us, but also in the hope that you will take that pledge. And I can tell you from experience, you will not notice 1% of your income going to these charities, but you will notice the impact when it's reported to you by us, by GiveWell, of what that very small amount of money can do. So we're going to be following up with you by email, but also we're on all the major types of social media. Please let us know if you're interested in taking the pledge or in starting a chapter to try and persuade other people to do that. And my colleague Kenan has just put links for the site where you can take the pledge and also to find out more about starting a chapter in the chat at the bottom of your screen. So moving on to today's guest, Elie is joining us. Elie was at Bridgewater working. I'm going to actually ask you to explain what Bridgewater is in a second, Elie, but I believe it's a hedge fund. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a hedge fund. Perfect.
Excellent, nailed it. So Elie was working at a hedge fund and wanted to make a donation where he would apply the sort of commercial reasoning that he applied in his day job to finding the right charities to give to. And what he found was that the information that he was looking for was not available. And so he founded or co-founded GiveWell with, I believe, the mission of giving people that information and helping them to identify extremely effective and efficient places to donate. And we fast forward to today, GiveWell is moving over $100 million with its recommendations. It is, I think, a staff of about 30 now. Is it more than that, Elie?
It's about 40 now. We've grown.
About 40. It seems to be adding staff all the time. And actually, they're advertising at the moment. So if you're interested in working there, do please have a look at their website. And I think it's fair to say GiveWell is seen as certainly one of, if not the leading charity evaluator in the world. And Elie's been at the heart of that journey. So we're delighted to have him with us. Elie, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jack. You're very kind. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate that introduction.
So just to start off with, for anybody who has never come across GiveWell before, if such people exist, could you let them know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, GiveWell's a research organization that tries to identify the charities that will save or improve lives the most with every donation that you make. And so our goal is to look through academic papers, thousands of charities to identify ones that run programs that have strong evidence behind them, programs that with small amounts of money make massive effects on people's lives, organizations that need more money to run the programs that they're going to do next, and importantly are highly transparent with the outside world. You know, in the charity sector, there are legal guidelines for what charities have to share with governments, but there are no guidelines that say charities have to share programmatic impact or results from their programs with the general public. And so it is impossible to really find good information on charities, or it's not in most cases, to know how much good they're doing and what impact you might have with the donation. And it was finding that exact thing, you know, being in a position to give, looking for information about charities, and then seeing firsthand how hard it was to get any information about how well charities programs are running. That led Holden Karnofsky, who's my co-founder, and I to start GiveWell back in 2007. And we started it, like Jack said, with a goal of providing this information about which charities can accomplish the most good possible to people who are just like us, you know, young people working in the private sector, trying to give money and do good with our charitable donations.
And it's worth saying this is a really good fit for One for the World, because we're asking people to give a relatively small amount of money, so only 1 cent on the dollar from their income, and we're trying to convince them that that can have an extraordinary impact at the far end. I think when I'm talking about One for the World, the question that I get most is, okay, how do you choose your charities? So can you explain the sort of characteristics of the charities that are on your recommended lists at the moment, and also how you see those changing in the near future and the medium term, if you do see them changing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, we start by looking at academic evidence about what programs work. And what I mean by academic evidence is research that's coming out of universities and the global health and development community to identify programs that can have significant impact. And so we are, you know, we have looked at, gosh, like thousands and thousands of research papers to identify programs where the impacts are very clear, very large, and a very good value for money. And once we identify the programs that we believe are very promising. So for example, one of the programs that we recommend is distributing malaria nets that protect against the mosquitoes that transmit malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. And this program has been studied for many years. And there's more than 20 randomized controlled trials, with randomized controlled trials being the gold standard of evidence that we use to determine if a medical treatment is effective. More than 20 of those trials demonstrate that when you distribute nets to people, they tend to use them. Those people are then protected against mosquitoes, malaria rates fall, and that leads to fewer deaths from malaria. So we identify that program. And then the next challenge is finding an organization that can deliver that program. And if you go to Google and you type in charity malaria, you'll get a long list of organizations. But the question we have is, which organization can demonstrate that it's effectively distributing these nets? So we know that if you distribute the nets effectively and people use them, that you will have an impact on malaria. But that still raises a question for a donor about, well, where do you send your check, and how well does this organization actually do at buying nets, identifying places that need nets, distributing nets, getting nets out into places that are hard to reach, and then teaching people to use them? And so we look for organizations that can demonstrate that they have a historical track record of effectively running this program. So we'll do those two things, and then we'll start diving in on the organization itself. And some of the big questions we have for them, first and foremost, after we've evaluated their track record, is to say, will you use more money? I mean, I think one question that comes up a lot when we talk about malaria is, you know, this program now, for people who think about charity, is well known. The US government and governments around the world give a lot of money to it. The Gates Foundation supports it. Is there a need for more? And a big part of our research is assessing that question. And with malaria specifically, there is demonstrably a big need for more. Hundreds of millions of dollars a year would deliver additional nets to people who need them in sub-Saharan Africa. And we know that because of the research we've done to try and answer that question. And so we go through that whole process to identify programs, organizations, and then vet those organizations before they end up on our list. There are a lot of ways that that list might change in the near future. I should say first, we don't expect our list to vary a lot from year to year. And the reason for that is, I guess charity moves slowly relative to something like the financial markets. It took a long time to build up the evidence about malaria nets being effective. It takes, and once we evaluate an organization like the Against Malaria Foundation or the other groups on our list to be a very effective deliverer of a specific program, that's not likely to change on a year-to-year basis. And so many of the groups we recommend now, we've recommended for a long time. There have been cases where groups have fallen off and new groups have joined, but our expectation is that as a core, that list is relatively stable. That said, we are roughly, I'd say 2/3 of what our research staff does is look for new places to direct money. And that could come from a few different places. First, new academic papers come out all the time. And we evaluate those papers, we consider them, and sometimes there is new evidence that leads us to exciting programs. I'm happy to talk about some of the examples there. GiveWell itself also has an incubation grants program where we support the development of groups that could become top charities. We've been supporting a group called New Incentives that provides cash to families in Nigeria to incentivize them to bring their children to get routine immunizations, measles and diphtheria, and all the things we don't think about very much here in high-income countries, but remain problems in low-income countries. That's a group we've been supporting since 2014, I believe, and we're getting the results from a big randomized controlled trial of their program we supported this year. And so they're a group we're evaluating as a potential top charity at the end of 2020. And then finally, we're also thinking about areas where we could do research that's outside the scope of the groups we've looked at to date, and those groups could have even more impact. We published a blog post yesterday about some grants we directed to organizations and individuals working to mitigate the effects of COVID-19 in low-income countries. Those follow a different process and a slightly different level of, or a very different level of due diligence than our top charities do, but we're also always saying, and this is really the core of our process, how can we do research to identify places to give money that will have the biggest effect on people's lives around the world?
I'm really pleased you mentioned two things there. So the first thing is the Against Malaria Foundation, because on Friday we have the founder of the Against Malaria Foundation, Rob Mather, also doing a webinar. So if you're interested in hearing from, I think probably the charity that GiveWell has most squarely stood behind throughout its lifetime, certainly a massive charity for One for the World, please do join us on Friday. But also just picking up on what you said there, we've had a lot of people asking us whether our recommendations, which mirror your recommendations, are likely to change during coronavirus. So could you just briefly give us the content of that blog post for people who haven't read it yet?
Yeah, sure. So the bottom line answer to the question is, our recommendation is still for people to give to GiveWell's recommended charities. And what we recommend to the outside world is give to GiveWell's fund that we regrant to top charities according to which charity needs the most funding at the time that we are making ongoing grants. That's our recommendation today. I expect that will continue to be our recommendation, notwithstanding the crisis. Though we also continue to look into opportunities that could mitigate the effects of this catastrophe. The reason for that is, it's really a fewfold. First, probably most importantly, what we're dealing with in high-income countries is an infectious disease that is very dangerous and deadly that we may not have the health system capacity to treat. And in low-income countries, that is exactly the situation people are in every day. Malaria, pneumonia, diarrhea, these are things that on a regular basis kill and cause sickness among hundreds of thousands of people, and the health system is insufficient to treat all of them. And so these are just massive needs that remain, notwithstanding COVID-19. I think in particular, and this is something, I think everything I'm going to say from here on out is less due diligence than things GiveWell would normally say, because we are just learning about how one might respond to COVID-19 every day. So with that caveat, our impression is that there's a real danger that funding will really slow down for some of these common diseases that affect people in low-income countries, things like pneumonia, malaria, and more. We've already seen some evidence of that. And so, we suspect that the needs among our top charities and similar interventions will be greater in the future than they were in the past. That said, we continue to focus pretty intensively on what we could potentially give to or recommend to mitigate the direct effects of COVID-19, either the health burden or the economic burden. We directed some grants, and if you read the blog post, you can see, sort of very quickly, because we felt that time was doing this quickly was imperative to have as much impact as possible, even though we weren't in a position to evaluate them as much as we normally would. And these grants went to a group called Development Media International, which has been on GiveWell's standout list for a long time. They're going to deliver radio programs that communicate messages about social distancing, hand washing, caring for the vulnerable, and basic facts of COVID-19 to people who we suspect would not get those messages otherwise, or might not get them in the way that we're sort of constantly getting them from so many places. And then we also directed grants to an organization called ID Insight and an academic named Mushfiq Mubarak to support government data collection and policy development in Bangladesh and then in other countries around the world.
Yeah, and I really would like to echo that. I've been speaking to some of the charities that One for the World and GiveWell support, and this is a very challenging time for them. Their funding is uncertain. They have a responsibility to protect their frontline workers. Some of them are being asked by donor governments to try to pivot into COVID response programs, which they're actually not necessarily best placed to do. And the sort of terrible reality is coronavirus is obviously just an awful phenomenon that's with a huge human cost, huge economic cost. But that was true of the other health conditions and poverty related causes that One for the World and GiveWell are trying to address before coronavirus came along. A stat that's used a lot is 11,000 children under the age of 5 die every day from preventable poverty related causes. And that was true before coronavirus, and it will be true after it. So I'd like to echo what you said. It is important that we do what we can to help deal with this current situation, but also important that we keep funding these organizations which are chipping away at these persistent problems all the time. We've got some fantastic questions coming in on the Q&A. I'd like to just pick up one of them, a really interesting question from Sebastian, who says, GiveWell have raised a lot of money. So you're moving about $160 million last year, he says. I think that is right. But he says this is still only a tiny fraction of the overall donation market. What do you think are the reasons for that? Do you think that there's a limit to the market size of effective giving?
Yeah, Sebastian, that's a great question. So I'd say that at the moment, we're not sure about the answer. What we're doing to try and to answer better and hopefully move more money is significantly build out our outreach team. And so our outreach team's focus is trying to raise more money for the recommendations that we make. This is something in GiveWell's first decade, we said consistently that we were prioritizing research over outreach. And in the last couple of years, we've turned towards prioritizing trying to raise more money more than we were before. And so what that means, especially to your question, Sebastian, is we're doing more research, both of, essentially surveying our existing donors. This year, we're also going to do more concerted efforts on surveying and doing focus groups with non-donors. And concretely, we're going to be doing more advertising, more improvements to our website, both to try and understand, both to try and directly move more money to the recommendations that we make, but also try to better understand what we could do and what the obstacles are to moving money. I think that so that's the plan. If I had to speculate, I would say that to date, in the vast majority of conversations I've had with non-donors, they tend to take a different attitude to their giving than most GiveWell donors. I suspect many people who are affiliated with One for the World do, where the question, and the GiveWell community has is, how do I use my donation to save or improve lives the most? That's the question we started with, that then drives this whole process. I think many people don't start with that question. Don't start thinking about that question as the core one. And I think the question is, given that, what can we do to either get them to ask that question, or how can we market GiveWell to them in a way that's true to our brand and core value added, while also being compelling to them as donors?
This seems like a really good time to ask, and this is another thing I get asked a lot as ED at One for the World. Why do you fund One for the World?
And so, One for the World is just a part of that. One of the things we've seen historically is that so many people who give money to us today learned about GiveWell when they were in school, whether it's undergrad or graduate school. And, years later, and now GiveWell, we started in 2007. So there are people who, actually, it made me feel old. One of our staff members learned about GiveWell when she was in junior high. That made me feel really old, but many of our donors have heard about us in college. And I think that, college is a time, and other graduate school is a time when people don't, at that point, have a lot of money to give. But it is a time when people are thinking very openly about what they want to do with their lives, what type of impact they could have. It's a time when people are exposed and open to a lot of different ideas about what they could do. And so we see One for the World as just a great mechanism to reach people at a time in their lives when I think not only are they open to the message of effective giving, but in many cases, I think it's a message that people would really value because they're trying to think about the life they want to lead.
Yeah, and I'd like to echo that, not just because it's sort of my professional responsibility to say I think One for the World is a good thing, but because I have been really thinking about this in the last few weeks and even being challenged by some people on it. So I had a very interesting conversation with an academic at Harvard Business School who was pretty skeptical of the One for the World model. But what we agreed on is there is certainly a chance, in fact, I think I'd say a probability, that we are changing the beliefs and values of the people who we encounter on university campuses who take this pledge, that they wouldn't otherwise be donating to effective charities, that they maybe wouldn't even have heard of effective giving or effective altruism. And that is something, I think you're right, there's a time of life when people are prepared to make quite profound changes that will affect the rest of their life. I mean, I compare it to people going vegetarian or vegan. People seem to be more prone to do this when they're under 35, and then that can become a sticky habit that stays with them for a long time. And I really think the same about effective giving. Sebastian, I think I really believe we can grow the market. The market for effective giving has not reached its ceiling yet. Whether or not it has a limitless ceiling, I don't know. But if we can spread the word to thousands of students every year as they're coming through university and get them hooked on this idea and get them to take a pledge to do this every month the rest of their lives, we can really grow this market. I believe that very passionately. Another question that I had for you, Elie. So this has been suggested to me by a couple of people. Obviously, right now, what GiveWell does is it starts off by looking for just the most effective causes it can find. But if we wanted to influence a wider set of people, you could adopt a model where you said, if you tell us which causes you're passionate about, we will try to recommend in that area very good places to give. And I think probably the most well-known example of this is Founders Pledge, where they ask their founders, this is an organization where people pledge a percentage of their equity to charities if they exit as a founder of a company. They start off by saying, what are you interested in, and then try to make recommendations in that area. So I just wondered what your thoughts on that model were and why you've steered clear of that up to now.
Yeah. So I think organizations have to really find their core competency and then really lean into that and execute on it. And I think what makes GiveWell special, in my opinion, is that we are just a group of people obsessed with the question of finding the opportunities that deliver the most value for money. Early in our history, so in our first 3 years, we actually thought that we were going to run this menu model that Jack, you're describing. And two things happened. First, we saw much less demand for it in the market than we expected. And I'm happy to talk more about the history or share that blog post if folks are interested after the fact. And then also, we just didn't feel like we were great at that, or that was like our core competency in the way that we could obsess over, what are the places that have the most impact. When we tried to start ranking organizations in subsectors, it felt like we were compromising on maximizing value for money in ways that didn't allow us to do our best work. And so I think for us, it's just been an organizational strategic decision to focus on the thing that we are going to do the best job at. If someone else said, we want to set up the GiveWell for cause area X or do this type of broader work, I mean, we would definitely support that. And so we've, worked with and supported animal charity evaluators when they got started, not financially, but, in conceptually, in helping them, kind of figure out their path. We talk to Founders Pledge regularly. And I think the vision where this cause area specific recommender could come from is somewhere outside of GiveWell. And then we would just love to, support those groups to do the best that they could do in their focus areas.
Yeah, and I do think it's worth saying, you're on record as saying that it helps you sleep more easily, that you have animal charity evaluators who are making great recommendations in another, cause area that people are passionate about. I've argued to a lot of people that given that much, in my view, probably most philanthropy is quite bad philanthropy. If what you're looking for is an end product, it's important to have GiveWell, I think, being the anchor on that side of that spectrum of how you think about giving that is quite purist. And I've always felt, already you've, if you like, influenced the space in that direction. And I think you provide a valuable service in doing that. You talked about being a team of people who are obsessed by this question of where you can donate most effectively. And we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A about how people might go about entering into a career in your space. What are you looking for? What sort of background do your staff have? And how can the many students who are watching this increase their chances of working for GiveWell or at somewhere like GiveWell?
Yeah, so the two areas where we're looking for people most right now, and they're reflected in the positions on our website. First, we're looking for researchers who can help really lead our work forward. And, there we're looking for people who, I'd say there's probably, a few key components of what makes someone great in that research role. We're looking for someone who, really cares about getting an answer to a difficult question. And I think that ultimately is what makes GiveWell people tick. If there's a difficult, important question that involves some quantification, but some soft qualitative reasoning, and you're just going to keep digging until you get a good answer, that's really the style of the GiveWell researcher. So I think someone who has that sort of base style in mind, and then the people sort of in terms of their qualifications, people tend to have a background both in empirical evidence. So that could be, an advanced degree sometimes, working in a job where they had to evaluate academic evidence or dealt with it critically. And then also, some effort to translate that academic evidence into the real world. So people who've worked at the intersection of policy and evidence are the sorts of people who I think end up having the background that we're looking for the most. And that's on the research side. On the and then on the outreach side, the position that we're hiring for right now is a gift officer. And the goal of the gift officer is to be engaged with a group of about 100 major donors, so people who are giving I don't know, 5 to 6 figures or more to our recommended charities, and build a relationship with them so that they have a really as good an understanding as they would like about the way GiveWell works and the impact our charities are having. In that role, we're looking for someone who either has direct experience in fundraising, sort of across any nonprofit sector, or maybe some experience in sales, where it's a similar type of function. I think in that role, I suspect the learning curve may be shorter, and there are opportunities for people who are excited about a job where they would meet with people, answer their questions, think about how we could deliver our donors the type of information they want to motivate them to give significantly. That's what the role is about at its core. And we're really trying to build out a team to focus on that at GiveWell, because we think there's a big opportunity to engage more successfully with our existing donor base.
And I think it's worth saying, the research side of GiveWell, it obviously requires some technical skills, some academic, pedigree, I suppose. But the outreach side, I sort of speak from experience here, because my wife's a researcher and I'm not, and obviously working on more on the outreach side of the sector. It seems to me that there are a lot of positions in that outreach side in effective giving and effective altruism at the moment. I saw that New York is hiring an EA coordinator at the moment. One for the World is hoping to hire another position in the next 12 months. GiveWell's been hiring on that side some incredibly talented people. Just following on from that, this was a question that came in advance, which I was really interested in. Someone who has visited some GiveWell charities in Uganda and said, how convinced are you that the charities that you're recommending are more impactful than charities that are just not well suited to randomized control trials, which is a method that you guys, review a lot when evaluating your charities?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. The short answer is that when I think about what it takes for a charity to demonstrate that it's really high value for money, obviously that's a heavy bar for anyone to meet. But when we spend a lot of time searching through so many programs and so many charities, and most of the time the reason that we're not moving forward with them is that we just we don't believe, based on the information that we have, that those programs are going to be as valuable for the money donated as our top recommendations are. And I think that actually on reflection, this shouldn't be that surprising. We know, and again, I'm sort of I'll talk about vitamin A supplementation just so I don't talk about malaria the entire time. We know that from many trials that this extremely cheap pill reduces child mortality. And I don't remember the dollar figure off the top of my head, but we're talking about in the range of $1 a year to deliver this pill that reduces child mortality by 25%. It can be delivered that cheaply because it's just this program that's operating at such large scale. And so there's been this huge investment in identifying what seems like almost a fantasy level opportunity to help people. And it's this incredibly cheap, incredibly scalable, incredibly wide reaching effort. And it is, I'd say empirically very hard for other charitable opportunities to surpass that bar. And we know that based on the research we do looking at many organizations and interventions. And I think from more of an intuitive perspective, it doesn't surprise me that much that, it would be difficult for like a small organization with less scale to deliver as much value for money as some of the top charities do, because they're just able to lean on this huge body of evidence and these incredibly inexpensive treatments to deliver at scale.
Yeah, so just following on from that, I know I've asked you about, things that you might broaden your top charity list to work in, but quite a few people have said, can we, would GiveWell ever be able to identify something that prioritized economic development? Because there is quite a strong argument that, we know that economic development over the last 30 years has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty as defined by the World Bank. But I appreciate it's a hard area to find a charity that's, or anything, it doesn't have to be a charity, an intervention that's hugely effective in. So do you think that's an area that, that you might look at in the future, or do you just think that's going to be too hard to attribute causation in?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts of that. There's the programs that directly alleviate poverty or improve economic development on a smaller scale. And I'll give an example of one of those. And then, there's also the sort of very broad, almost macroeconomic or countrywide policy level interventions that could improve economic development on a larger scale. We aim to look at both, and we'll have things to say about both, I hope. The former, meaning the micro interventions, are much easier than the latter. We've done a lot more work historically on the micro interventions. And I want to give one more example of that. But just briefly on the latter, on the macroeconomic interventions, we would like to look into this. And it is part of our, long-term plan to get there. But, I think it will be extremely challenging for the unsurprising reason that there's just a huge debate about what drives development in low-income countries. I'd say, in short, again, not kind of delivering any news here, we don't really know the answer, and that's exact. And then the challenge of donating is exacerbated by the fact that not only do you need to know the answer about what to do, but also where to give and how that will actually drive change. So we'd like to look into it. We plan to, and this is part of GiveWell's long-term vision of really evaluating anything and considering anything that we think could truly be highest value for money in improving or saving lives of people around the world. Just a brief note on the sort of micro intervention. I want to give an example. We just published a page, I believe, about a group called Bridges to Prosperity, and they're kind of interesting. They build bridges in over rivers in parts of in rural parts of low-income countries, with an idea of making it easier for people to travel between homes and markets to facilitate economic development. In some of the initial trials they did, they found very strong results. They're running an additional trial now in sub-Saharan Africa. Unfortunately, I think the trial has most likely been suspended due to the lack of the ability to do field experiments. But that is the type of program that we're even looking at currently as we speak. And I think that it's obviously a program that's operating on a very small scale, but enabling people to have easier transportation and access to markets is the sort of program that I think you would expect to have broader economic implications if it itself is successful.
And it is always worth saying that Give Directly is a top charity at GiveWell, and it does a lot of things by sending unconditional cash transfers to people, but economic development is certainly part of that. It wouldn't operate at the macro scale, but it is incredibly effective on a micro level. And it is interesting, if we are looking for a silver lining on the current circumstances, the general adoption of unconditional cash transfers in the States could be really, really interesting. It could fundamentally change people's opinion of that as a policy intervention in developed countries, let alone in developing countries. So there is potentially, I hope, the chance for that to become a more mainstream part of the conversation going forward. An interesting question here from Bara. I appreciate I'm hopping around a bit now because I'm responding to the questions, so we've lost our theme. But an interesting question, which is, obviously a lot of people who donate to the GiveWell top charities are quite data driven, but she's asked whether you think the sort of the branding of the charities has an impact, and also if the branding of some charities is, you know, the best deal, the sort of best transactional charity has an effect. So I wonder if you could talk about that, and also about how you're learning about how non-data driven reasoning plays a part for GiveWell's donors.
Yeah, that is a really, that's a great question. It's an extremely timely question because, you know, as we've built up this outreach function and we're thinking a lot about marketing, I mean, this is like literally the question we're thinking about on a daily basis. And I'd say the marketing team is obsessing over. We definitely see that today, our donor base is data-driven. And the question we have is that because data-driven donors are the ones who give effectively or want to give effectively? Or is it just that GiveWell essentially presented ourselves and were marketed as data-driven charity, data-driven giving? For a long time, we used to joke that our website was ugly, but good ugly, because we were appealing to a certain type of person. And when we reflect on this now, you know, I think that like GiveWell should appeal, and this goes back, Sebastian, to your question, GiveWell should appeal to people who want to save or improve lives the most. Like that's what GiveWell is about. And the question is, how do we communicate that message to the largest demographic, the largest population possible to drive the most funding? And I think this is the particular challenge here, is that I think every charity, not every charity, many charities make claims about impact to the point where making a claim about impact to the general public just feels like what everyone else is saying. And so I think what GiveWell needs to do is to figure out how to promise that what we're delivering is sort of the best expectation of saving the most lives or improving lives as much as possible, and then demonstrate that we can really deliver on that promise. And I don't, you know, data has worked to date, but I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to get there without purely relying on the types of, you know, highly analytical, highly intellectual and intensive engagement type arguments that we've made historically.
And I think that, you know, not to keep plugging one for the world necessarily, but I think this is something where we're really interesting, because I suspect that our members have some overlap, but not a total overlap with GiveWell's sort of traditional donor base. You know, we are reaching out at a level where people don't have to engage completely with the GiveWell method. They don't have to engage completely with the idea that maximizing impact of all giving is very important, or that, you know, they don't have to dive into the data. You know, around 75% of our donors actually delegate the choice of where to send the money to us. And I think that speaks to the fact that we're appealing to a wider demographic and growing that market, as we said earlier. Really, a question I'm really interested in, actually. I apologize if I pronounce your name wrong, but it's from Ursula. How much leverage do you think is created when a new charity joins the list of GiveWell's top charities? Do you know roughly how much money that is worth in annual donations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure how to think about that question. I might answer it in terms of how much additional funding can a charity raise because it's on the list that is money that wouldn't otherwise go to our top charities list. I think we really don't have an easy way of answering that question. I'll say this, you know, what we see now is that, you know, charities that we recommended when they were like extremely small. So I think the first time I ever talked to Rob Mather at the Against Malaria Foundation in 2008, I think AMF had a budget of about £1 million. It's multiples of that today. When we first talked to Paul Niehaus at Give Directly, gosh, I think their budget was south of $500,000. Both of those groups have, you know, we have directed a lot of money to both of those groups because they're exceptional, but they have also raised a lot of money from other sources. And I think AMF and Give Directly in particular are groups where, you know, I think we have played a role in helping support their development from an early stage. And then they have also built on that independent of GiveWell to just build these, now large budget, outstanding organizations that are in a position to raise money from all sorts of sources, and in Give Directly's case especially, work to change the conversation around giving, both with the general public and inside government agencies, where they're pushing for more and better research on the impacts that programs are having.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, I forget exactly what the time period of this is. I think it's 4 or 5 years. But when I spoke to Rob recently, he said he thought he could attribute $100 million to effective giving and effective altruism that's come into AMF, which is a pretty staggering amount of money, given the size they were before they were highlighted by effective giving and effective altruism. Another question here that I'm super interested in, because it's actually one that my wife would like to ask you as well. So she's a researcher in international development, more on the qualitative than the quantitative side. And this question is from Jessica, who's a global health student. Have you looked at all at family planning as an intervention, which does have some quite strong evidence around having a range of sort of subsidiary benefits and is relatively cheap to deliver? And what are your thoughts on that as a cause area? Is it on your radar?
Yes, it's a great question. It's definitely on our radar. It's family planning is a place where we have found it challenging to identify delivery models for programs that we believe, at least in what we've seen to date, have a strong track record of increasing, I should say, increasing access to, and then, clearly intentional use of family planning products. And I think there's, two crucial challenges here. One is there's just a structural challenge in assessing, increasing access. We just haven't seen in ways that tie to specific charity programs. We've really had trouble, nailing that down. This program is also a place, I should say, where the monitoring that we would look for, I think, is particularly challenging, because what I think one would want to promote with family planning is access to family planning, so that individuals can make a decision about what they want to use, or if they want family planning, rather than maximizing the number of people who are using contraceptive products. And so we've just generally, to date, struggled to find opportunities that we are very confident in. We have also, unfortunately, failed, I believe, to publish some of the research that we've done on family planning. One of the mistakes on our mistakes page that bothers me the most right now is the fact that we have this failure to publish all of the underlying research we've done that builds into our conclusions. This bugs me so much, because one of GiveWell's core values is transparency. And so where we're not publishing this information, we're just not meeting one of the core goals of us as an organization. And family planning is one of the areas that's sort of fallen into that bucket of areas that we haven't written about. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to share more about that in the future, and can give a more specific, substantiated answer to the question that goes beyond the very high level I could give just now.
A question that is a little bit more technical, but has had quite a few upvotes. How are you going to change your moral weights framework, which I think is something you've said that you're intending to do?
Yeah, so just to quickly explain what moral weights are all about. So, imagine, I've said a couple times this very simple line: GiveWell wants to save or improve lives the most with every donation. But there's different ways that one can improve lives. And you can increase someone's income, you can reduce a health burden. And, while there are ways that policymakers make these decisions, we've talked, I think, probably more in the last 6 weeks than normal about the value of a statistical life, and comparing morbidity, that is the disability or sickness cause that doesn't lead to death, against deaths. It seems to us that there has really been insufficient thought put into how to make these decisions as well as possible. And therefore, we don't find ourselves, we're not very comfortable just relying on an existing framework for trying to assess either the comparison between health and income, death and income, between morbidity and mortality, i.e. burden of disease and death, or even deaths at different ages. So, the death of someone with 20 years of life expectancy versus someone with 10 years of life expectancy. And so we struggle to answer those questions, but we have to answer those questions in some way, because the programs we recommend work across the scope of, all of those types of good achieved. And certainly, when donors want to make those decisions for themselves, we're very happy. You can go to our website, think about your own values, because certainly we are not, we have nothing really like expert to add on morality, moral philosophy. So, please do that. But there's also money that we direct. And so we have to answer the question, how do we compare one thing to another? So with all of that context in mind, the answer is that we still don't know exactly how we're going to update these weights. What we want to combine is input from beneficiaries. So that is, input from the people who are directly benefits by the programs that we support. We funded a group called IB Insight to do research and survey beneficiaries. We wrote about this research last fall, and you can read about that. We'd like to do more of that. We would also like to survey our donor community. We want to ensure that what we're delivering to the donors who use our research is what they expect. And we just need to know where they are coming from. And then, we want to do, I'd say, finally, some critical reasoning to incorporate, more of an analytical, cerebral approach to trying to reason out how to compare things to one another, combine all that together in some way that's still to be determined, and use that as the driver of the recommendations that we make.
Fantastic. Definitely one for the effective altruists who dialed into this, I think, and do go and contribute your thoughts as well, as Elie says. Elie, I'm conscious of your time. I've just got a couple more questions to finish up with, and it's worth saying many of these questions start by thanking you for what GiveWell does and for your time today, which I'd like to echo. You guys are doing a fantastic job, and obviously very, very important partners for One for the World. So we really do appreciate you joining us this evening. Sorry, it's not this evening, of course. I'm in the UK. For most of you, it's lunchtime. But yes, this evening where I am. So a question, just returning to this idea of what people should do when they're looking ahead to their careers. A question about how do you see the advantages of trying to do direct work, so potentially for one of the charities that you recommend, or even founding a new charity that might become a GiveWell top charity, versus earning to give and trying to donate as much as possible, versus trying to work in the sort of meta charity space like GiveWell and One for the World. So, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so, I feel like I'm probably speaking to people who are students or fairly young. I'm gonna be the old crotchety man in my answer here. I think that, the two generic pieces of advice that I'd really ask people to keep in mind as they're thinking about their careers are, first, when you finish school, you just don't know that much. And I think the first imperative of someone in their career is really learning how to add value. That means finding things that you're good at, that you can do, where you can really make a difference. And when I say make a difference, I don't just mean have an impact on the world. I mean, like, literally do something that's good and makes a difference to the company you're working for. I learned so much from my internships, from working at a hedge fund, and not just analytically, just about how to be a good employee that makes a difference. And I see this every day when we hire someone right out of school, and we've hired a lot of people right out of school. They're in a different place than someone who's learned how to be effective in their first in their years on the job. I mean, the difference is really palpable. And so the first piece of encouragement that I'd offer is, yeah, I mean, you are at the beginning of a career and the first job is to just be effective. If you can do that, you are going to have so many opportunities because as simple and boring as that sounds, many, many people are not that effective. And so if you can do that, you are well served. And then second, I think importantly, especially when it comes to these choices about meta charity, earning to give, what cause to work in, really figure out what you're good at. Another thing I've learned, both as I reflect on my own career and myself and look at our staff, very, very colloquially, like everyone is different. People have very different strengths and weaknesses. People have different superpowers. And, you probably don't know what your superpower is because it just feels so easy to you. But if you can, through talking to people, through observing the world, through trying to do things, can identify those things that you uniquely bring to the world, that you're especially good at, that's where you want to be. Because, if I were trying to do things that are not what I'm best at, I wouldn't be able to reason myself to the place where I'll have the most impact. I'd be able to, find my way here by constantly iterating to identify and then fall into the place where I can do the most good. And even in my job today, I'm CEO of GiveWell, that can mean so many different things. But a lot of the choices I make are driven by trying to focus my time in my role around those activities where I think I'm really good. And then trying to get like the rest of our amazing staff to work on the things where I'm absolutely terrible and I have nothing useful to add and I'll only cause problems.
I think that's a fantastic answer. And I really would echo that. If you look even at just one for the world's tiny stuff, we have someone, Kenan, who was teaching in a charter school for a year. We had Evan, who Deloitte were trying to poach, and we had to wrest him from them. Laurent has been advising disaster relief in South Africa. I ran a charity for 8 years that will never get on the GiveWell recommended list, and these paths are what have led us to what we're doing now. So any experience is good experience, and I really would emphasize, start doing things. If you're still at university, start running a One for the World chapter. This will build skills that you will use for the rest of your career. Elie, I can't believe an hour has gone by so quickly. That is so interesting. I really, really do appreciate your time. I'm going to draw stumps there. We'll be sending out this webinar as a video in due course, and also you'll have the chance to follow up with us about doing stuff through One for the World. But Elie, thank you very much for your time and keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. And thanks everyone for the questions. This was great. My pleasure.